I've been asked over the past probably couple years, maybe more than any other time in my life, are we in the end times? And I always say, I don't really know. There certainly are seasons that the scriptures talk about that feel familiar to some of the things we see, but there are also signs, there are events that I think have to happen that I haven't seen yet, and so I always say I don't know, but it has increased over the past couple years, and some people don't ask, they just say, we have to be. Certainly we are coming to the end. How long can God just allow the world to race away from him at the pace that it currently is? It's been on people's minds with, as I said, increasing measure over the past couple years. Because I don't know, as I hear that question, do you think we're in the end times? For me, personally, the more pressing question is, how should I, or how ought I most faithfully live if and when we are? You see, I can't control. I have no say or sway over when the Lord returns. Now, I have no control over the direction of our politics globally. I can't do anything about that, but what I can control is how I respond to it. How I live within a culture or a climate that is increasingly hostile to the God that I serve and that I love. And so this series through the book of Habakkuk, as much as anything else, my hope is for us that it pushes and prompts each of us to consider not so much are we living in the end times, but how will I live, whether I am or I am not. Today we conclude the series as we come to the end of the book of Habakkuk. 3 weeks ago, we saw Habakkuk ask God the question, God, where are you as the corrupt thrive? I look around me, and those who carry your name, those who claim to serve you and love you, are not living the way you've called them or called us to live. How in the world can you allow that to continue? And then God responded, didn't he? And he said, I am going to clean house. I am going to bring punishment on my own home, on my own people. And when he kind of laid out how that was going to happen, Habakkuk was even more confused. How in the world, God, why would you allow evil not only to continue, but if you're bringing the Babylonians, certainly the wickedness that we are already seeing and experiencing will only increase. How can you allow wickedness to thrive in your creation? And God responds again. Last week we worked our way through the woes of Habakkuk chapter 2, where we're forced to consider not just the wickedness of the world, but our own culpability in it. And to ask the question, God, what have I brought to the table? What have I done personally to add to the degradation of your creation? Where am I responsible? What must I change in my attitudes or my behaviors? It's been 3 pretty heavy weeks. Today we come to chapter 3, and the last question we want to examine in the book of Habakkuk is, God has told Habakkuk what would happen. The nation of Judah will fall. There is no turning back from it. It is going to happen. Habakkuk knows that there are painful days ahead as he watches his nation, his country, his neighbors, as he knows he will watch them, observe them suffer greatly. And so now Habakkuk responds to God in this beautifully poetic prayer, which is chapter 3. And really the prayer is Habakkuk saying, Lord, I don't like what I see. I certainly am not looking forward to what will come, but I will respond to you and declare certain commitments to you in the midst of it. While I wait for your perfect plan to play itself out, Lord, this will be my response. This is my resolve to walk through it. So I would say to anyone who asks, how much longer can God allow the world to run away from him? How much more do we have to put up with the corruption and the incompetence and the incredible evil that we see around us? When people have that question, my response would be, read Habakkuk chapter 3. Read the whole thing, but settle in on 3 and commit yourself to walking as the prophet does through days that are difficult. I was a pretty good kid growing up. Firstborn, kind of that naturally compliant. I didn't want to step out of line. I tried to do everything the way I was told. And now I got in trouble, at home, but never at school. I was one of those students that I went in, I did my work, I kept my head down, played with my friends at recess, but I never got in trouble until one day in 4th grade. I got in trouble. I can remember it so vividly. It was so out of the norm for me. There was a girl in my class, I won't tell you her name, I did not like her. She was not kind. She was just a nasty girl, angry girl. And so one day, she and I had some interactions at the lunch table, and they were less than pleasant, we'll say. Nothing major, just some chirping and some words, and probably some sideways glances. And lunch got over, I went out to recess, played with my friends, played kickball. Don't remember how I did, but I was feeling much better, after running around for a bit. Came back into class, sat down at my desk. My back was to the door of our classroom. And apparently, while I was forgetting about our lunchroom interaction, she was stewing over it during recess. And she came into the room from behind me and gave me one of those open-handed whack right on the side of the face, on the head. Like 5-starred me right there. And I just reacted. I responded without thinking, not even really knowing who it was. I stood up out of my chair and turned around and gave her a shove. 2 hands, just whoo, shoved her away from me. And she stumbled backwards about 3 or 4 steps into the chalk tray of the chalkboard. As she stumbled into the chalk tray, Mr. Wittenberger walked in the room and saw just the end of it all. And there were tears. I'm pretty sure they were fake. And he said, "Josh, get in the hall now." Whew. This was uncharted territory for me. I had never received a stern word, especially from Mr. Wittenberger. I mean, he was an amazing teacher. He was friends with my parents. Out in the hall I went and leaned up against the hallway wall, just waiting for him to come out and to give me his sentence. It was an eternity while I waited. I knew I was in trouble. I knew that whatever the punishment was going to be, I likely deserved it. I knew Mr. Wittenberger was fair. Like I said, he was friends with my parents. So I knew all this about him, and I was still terrified. My blood pressure was through the roof. I was sweating profusely. I was terrified of what was coming down the pipe. This is the world that Habakkuk lives in, times 1,000, right? God has already declared that discipline is coming. chapter 3 is his response. I'm going to take time this morning to just read it to you. It's a prayer written in Hebrew poetic form. Lord, I've heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled, and the age-old hills collapsed, but he marches on forever. I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, the dwellings of Midian in anguish. Were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode your horses and your chariots to victory? You uncovered your bow. You called for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and and writhed. Torrents of water swept by. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear. In wrath, you strode through the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. With his own spear, you pierced his head when his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour the wretched who were hiding. You trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. I heard, and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the days of calamity to come on the nation invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. This is an incredibly poetic prayer by Habakkuk. It looks backwards and forwards. It speaks of God's activity in the past. It looks at his hand on Israel's past, recognizing how God has carried them, how he has sustained them even through dark days before. He makes in it a couple declarative commitments or statements. In verse 2, he starts off, Lord, I've heard of your fame, and I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. After this back and forth between Habakkuk and God, he responds. The prophet responds, Lord, I have seen your deeds in the past. I know what you have done. I have heard of your fame, and I'm in awe. I'm in awe of your strength. I'm in awe of your power, of your absolute sovereignty, God. And in it, I make commitments. You see, the first thing that Habakkuk does, verses 3 through 15, is he remembers what God has already done. He remembers who God has always been, how God has revealed himself throughout time. He recalls who God has always and faithfully maintained himself to be. God always acts the same way. according to his nature and his character. And so Habakkuk, in this moment where he's waiting for destruction to come, he knows the days ahead are dark, darker than the dark days that he's already experienced. It doesn't look that hopeful, and yet his heart is turned to God to say, I know how you behave. I know who you are because I've seen it before. And in it, he not only remembers, but he asks for, he requests mercy as God marches forth. Verses 3-6, he speaks of Teman and Mount Paran. It's a reference all the way back to Abraham. When God made promises to Abraham, he brought Abraham into a new land, and there were already some who lived there. Some of them were kind to Abraham and his family, but many were not. And Abraham saw God act powerfully on his behalf. Creation itself responded to God's presence and his power as he revealed himself and moved on Abraham's behalf. Then Habakkuk remembers beyond Abraham, centuries later, to the days of Moses, when Abraham's descendants found themselves enslaved by the Egyptians. They lived in a period of time then that looked like they would never experience freedom as a people. The Egyptian empire was so powerful that the Hebrew people were mistreated and abused and enslaved for over 400 years. And Habakkuk makes mention of the time when God brought his people out of slavery. He did the impossible, rescuing them from their captors, opening the Red Sea. And in verse 8, were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode your horses and your chariots to victory? God delivered his people as he had promised centuries before. You see, God's people hadn't escaped the hardship of Egypt. They had been abused. They hadn't enjoyed sovereignty as a people, and yet God didn't forget them. And Habakkuk recalls that. He remembers it now. Abraham, and then Moses, he talks about the sun and the moon standing still in verses 11 and 12 and 13. God cast out the wicked Canaanites from the land as he delivered it to Joshua and the rest of the Hebrew people, just as he had promised. He laid low the arrogant kings of Canaan, using these wandering nomads to take the land that he had promised them. Church, days will come. The scriptures are clear that the days will come when our faith no longer holds sway, has the influence that it once did over the civil lives that we have enjoyed. The day will come when the church does not have a powerful, influential voice in our culture. You could probably argue that those days may already even be here. The days will also come, the scriptures are clear, that God will eventually pour out his wrath on a wicked humanity that has completely abandoned him and turned their backs on him. That day is certain. And as a church, our responsibility is to live in those days, if we are here, remembering first of all, remembering who he is, remembering his faithfulness when it's difficult. His church ought to be secure in understanding, while the days may be difficult, We know who God is. We know how he behaves. We know that he rescues his people out and saves them for himself. But to remember that, we have to be familiar with him. We live in a time in history where the church is as biblically illiterate, I think, as maybe it's ever been. Even though we have the scriptures in print, I probably have 30 Bibles in my office. Each and every one of us has access to the scriptures on any electronic device. We have more access to commentaries and to explanations of what the scriptures teach us than at any point in history. And yet so many of those who claim to follow Christ know very little of the scriptures. We are, in large part, as a church, we are biblically illiterate. It's time for us to get back into the Word, to spend time in the Scriptures so that we would be familiar with who God is. We must know Him so that when it truly gets difficult, when the world is against God and His people in full force, that we might understand and know who He is, how He operates, and what He has promised He will do. What has He done in your life? Where have you already seen Him? When has He been faithful to you? When has He sustained you and provided for you? When has He stepped in and worked on your behalf or on behalf of your children or your parents or those you worship with on a regular basis? What do you know about your Heavenly Father? It carried Habakkuk in his first response to what he saw. Not only did he remember, but he requested in God's justice that God would also display mercy. We know that God cannot tolerate wickedness. We know that there will be a clash, a cosmic clash between wickedness, between evil, between Satan and his forces, between humanity that rejects God and God himself. If he is going to establish his eternal kingdom, there will be a separating at some point. The two cannot coexist. And yet, as Habakkuk understands that reality, he prays for mercy, knowing that this is the very character and nature of God himself. He is merciful and long-suffering. He does not desire that any would perish and be cast away from his presence. And Habakkuk prays in the moment for those who have resisted, that they might experience God's mercy. God's people throughout history have never to date escaped hardship when there is discipline at the hand of God. Noah and his family were saved through the flood. And yet they faced incredible hardship. They were mocked and ridiculed for hundreds of years as the ark was constructed. He lived on a boat with a pile of animals and everything they produced. It was not easy for Noah. When they came out of the ark, his kids immediately fell into sin again. The whole point was to come through, the righteous come through, the wicked to be expelled from the earth. And as soon as they come out, sin reestablishes its foothold on humanity. We see God's people in the exile in Babylon suffering through it. Now, we have the advantage to look back on history and to see that God reestablished his people, that he saved some of them through the horrors of the Babylonian Empire. And yet in it, so many of them lost their lives, were taken into slavery in a foreign nation. It was an unpleasant time. There was a pruning, if you will. There was hardship in it. God's people have never escaped abuse or grief. I can't imagine that at the end of the time, that as the end times play out, that because we're part of the church, we just kind of cruise on through all happy. There will be hardship. When God moves, and when mankind resists his movement, his people are caught between the anvil and the hammer. That there is hardship and pain in it. In that moment will we remember God's faithfulness and his mighty hand. We'll request his loving kindness to wash over us, to settle our souls in our hardship. Habakkuk asks God to show himself as he has done before, knowing that will bring with it an incredibly difficult season. He also requests mercy in it. Even the prayer itself leads Habakkuk to a place of incredible emotional crisis. If we look back at the prayer, Habakkuk expresses that he will appropriately and rightly in God's presence tremble before God, but also trust in God in those moments. Church, as the world gets to be a more difficult place to live under God's righteous standards and laws, as we find ourselves more and more put to the edges of culture, silenced by those who oppose him, we must understand that when God decides to make all things right again, that it is a fearful experience. It is a fearful time to live. And Habakkuk prays for God to do as he would see fit. And then he says, I will tremble before you, but I will also trust in you. Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 16. I heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. The author of 1 Chronicles writes similarly about another time. For great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. He is to be feared above all gods, for all the gods of the nations are idols. But the Lord made the heavens. Splendor and majesty are before him. Strength and joy are in his dwelling place. Ascribe to the Lord, all you families of nations. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. When we see God's strength, when we see his glory, we ought to be brought to a place where we tremble in it, under his incredible authority. Psalm 96:9. Worship the Lord in splendor, in the splendor of his holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. I find it fascinating how many times we see God's people called to worship him in his glory, and in the same moment to tremble before his holiness and his power. Proverbs 28:14. Blessed is the one who always trembles before God, but whoever hardens their heart falls into trouble. Again, Habakkuk says, I heard and my heart pounded. I've seen history repeat itself enough times, Lord. I know what happens when the world rejects you wholesale. When you ride in to establish your order and bring about your purposes. I heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones. My legs trembled underneath me. But then he finishes the thought. Yet I will wait patiently for the Lord, for the day of calamity to come to the nation invading us. we may be called to wait patiently in a season that goes against everything we cherish. Church, we may be called to love our neighbors, to speak truth in love. We may be called to continue to meet together when it's ridiculed, when it's mocked. We may be called on social media enemies of the state, extremists, fools. In it, do we trust the sovereignty of the Lord? Do we remember his mighty hand before? Will we wait patiently even if we tremble in the waiting? It's a commitment that Habakkuk made in his day. I think it's one we ought to make note of. Our crisis may come at the hands of men. It may come at the crumbling of creation itself as you read through Habakkuk's prayer. You see so often not only invading armies, but natural disasters. The Lord is God over all creation, of nations and of the earth itself. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, even if we face incredible hardship and famine. How does Habakkuk respond? Finally, he worships. Even in his hardship, he chooses to worship a good and loving, powerful God who moves all things toward his perfect end. I will worship and I will walk with God in all of it. Would we commit ourselves as God's people to tremble and to trust, but also to worship and walk faithfully with him? Verses 18 and 19 of chapter 3. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. I've been to Israel and the places in the wilderness where it's mountainous, that there are incredible cliff faces, and in it you have these small mountain goats called gedi. Tiny little goats that are hunted by other predators, and they scale these rock faces. You see them climbing the mountains. It appears that there's nothing to stand on, and yet they stand so secure. No predator can capture them as they climb the faces of these cliffs. There's incredible danger. One slip and they would fall hundreds of feet to their death. No doubt Habakkuk has seen the gedi. He understands that he walks through perilous days as he sees the Babylonian horde amassing and gathering to conquer the nation that he loves. He recognizes that his own leaders, politically and spiritually, offer little to no resistance against them. And if they did, they would use their strength and their influence to their own gain anyway. And Habakkuk likens himself to the goats climbing on the heights. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights securely. When the world looks a mess, remember the sovereign God who created it all and will bring it all into perfect order in his time. When you look and see that the world is a mess, request that he would express and pour out his mercy on you, on his people. tremble in his presence, recognize his sovereignty and his right to wait as long as he will wait, and to act at the moment he chooses to act, and trust in his perfect plan. Worship him for who he is, what he is capable, what he has done, and what he has promised he will yet do, and commit yourself to walk with him righteously and faithfully as instructed in his word. I don't know what the days will bring for us, but I do know the type of people we can be when we're led, when we're empowered and strengthened by the Holy Spirit to bring him honor in the ways that we live through it. God, we come before you giving ourselves fully to you, not only in years and seasons that are prosperous and pleasant, but God, even more so when they are treacherous, when they are unpleasant, when they are painful, when it looks like there is no way out of them, when we find ourselves disappointed and frustrated again. God, we know who you are. We trust you because you have acted consistent to your nature for all of time. God, you have shown us in your word that our existence is secure in your presence. And so, Father, we lean into it today. We lean into it tomorrow, whether things trend better or worse. We give ourselves to you. We ask for your mercy and your grace and your strength to walk faithfully as you would have us walk. Amen.
Rise grace when the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in. And when I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding of how I've been set free, there is a cross that bears the burden, where another died for me. There is another in the fire. All my debt left for dead beneath the waters. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. And should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning, either way I will bow to the things of this world. And no, I will never be alone. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding, will power set me free? There is a grave that holds nobody, now that power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Oh, 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 and I can see the light in the darkness. As the darkness bows to him, I can hear the roar in the heavens. As the space between where sin, I can feel the ground shake beneath us. As the prison walls cave in, nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come what may in the space between and the things unseen and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. I know I will never be alone. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding how good you've been to me, I'll count the joy come every battle, I know that's where you'll be. And I can see the light in the darkness. As the darkness bows to him, I can hear the roar in the heavens. At the space between west and I can feel the ground shake beneath us. As the prison walls cave in, nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between count the joy from every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. I'll count the joy from every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be.
Standing here in your presence, in the grace so relentless, I am one by perfect love, wrapped within the arms of heaven, in a peace that lasts forever, sinking deep in mercy. See, I'm wide awake, drawing close, stirred by grace, and all my heart is yours. All fear removed, I breathe you in, I lean into your love. Oh, your love. When I'm lost, you pursue me. Lift my head to see your glory, Lord of all. So beautiful. Here in you I find shelter, captivated by the splendor of your face. My secret space, I'm wide awake, drawing close, stirred by grace, and all my heart is yours. All fear removed, I breathe you in, I lean into your love. Oh, your love. Your love so deep is washing over me. Your face is all I see. You are my everything. Jesus Christ, you are my one desire. Lord, hear my only cry, to know you all my life. Love so deep is washing